Hello, and welcome to the review of procedure MG-O-004.11. Today, we will cover procedures related to adverse event management. Before we begin, it is important to address why this procedure is important to clinical research. The Food and Drug Administration and the Office of Human Research Protections recognize any unanticipated problem in research is potentially important because it may reflect additional risks to subjects. In accordance with their requirements, these regulatory bodies have outlined investigator responsibilities to protect the rights, safety, and welfare of subjects, including management of potential adverse events. The purpose of this procedure is to describe how the principal investigator and research team will fulfill their responsibilities for management of adverse events and ensure subject safety is protected and maintained. Adverse event management is a key element of research with human subjects, especially in ensuring data integrity and participant safety is upheld. As such, it is important to identify those who are responsible for the process's correct implementation. The scope of this procedure applies to principal investigators and research staff involved in the conduct of clinical research and, as delegated, who are responsible for management of adverse events, including unanticipated adverse device effects in human subjects research. Throughout this presentation, there are many key terms that will be utilized. Adverse event of special interest, serious adverse event or serious suspected adverse reaction, unanticipated adverse device effects, and unexpected adverse event or unexpected suspected adverse reaction are 5 definitions in particular that require some special attention. Adverse events are any untoward medical occurrence with the use of a drug in humans, whether or not considered drug-related, or any unfavorable and unintended sign, symptom, or disease temporarily associated with the use of a medicinal or investigational product, whether or not related to the medicinal or investigational product. Adverse event of special interest is any serious or non-serious noteworthy event for a particular product or class of products that a sponsor may wish to monitor carefully. Serious adverse events or serious suspected adverse reaction is an event if, in view of the investigator or sponsor, it results in death, a life-threatening adverse reaction, inpatient or prolongation of existing hospitalization, a persistent or significant incapacity of a congenital anomaly, or a birth defect. Unanticipated adverse device effects is any serious adverse event caused by or associated with a device. And lastly, unexpected adverse event or unexpected suspected adverse reaction is an adverse event not listed in the investigator brochure or is not listed at the specificity or severity that has been observed. If no investigator brochure is available, it is an adverse event not consistent with the risk information described in the general investigational plan or elsewhere in the current application. Additional terms that will not be defined in this training include encore, electronic health record, expectedness, investigator, life-threatening adverse event of life-threatening suspected adverse reaction, principal investigator, research, and test article. If you are unfamiliar with any of these terms, please take a moment to pause this video and visit the MedStar Georgetown Glossary to obtain the definition of the unfamiliar terms. Adverse event management is a key element of ensuring clinical research is a safe environment for human subjects. As such, it is important to identify those who are responsible for the process's correct implementation. Both the principal investigator and study team have specific responsibilities in adverse event management. The PI is ultimately responsible for ensuring adequate management of adverse events per the protocol and the reviewing IRB requirements. The research team should know and understand the protocol and review IRB definitions of adverse events and the necessary reporting agencies and timeframes. The PI can only delegate adverse event severity and causality assessment to advanced clinicians with appropriate experience and expertise in the relevant specialty who are also approved personnel, such as a PA or sub-investigator. In the first part of this procedural review, we have introduced the purpose, scope, and some key information about the procedure. We are going to transition into discussing the mandatory adverse event management procedures. There are 3 general steps of managing adverse events and ensuring requirements are appropriately met. We will identify the adverse event, assess and document the adverse event, and finally, report the adverse event. Let's go over each step in detail together. The first step of the adverse event management process is to identify the adverse event. PIs and the research team must start and end collecting adverse events as defined by the protocol. Assessment requirements for adverse events should also be defined by the protocol. There are many obligations PIs and research teams have at this stage. The PI and research team must ensure that subject safety is always the primary concern and should not direct or implement any medical care as needed in response to an adverse event. For studies in which the PI and research team are blinded to the investigational treatment, unblinding may be necessary for safe medical care of the subject. The PI and research team should reference the protocol or study manual of procedures and consult with the investigational pharmacy and sponsor when appropriate for appropriate unblinding procedures. The PI or whomever delegated must be engaged in the contemporaneous review of adverse events for severity, expectedness, and relationship to study intervention with the relevant study personnel. The PI and research team must understand what may constitute a new adverse event. The definition of a new adverse event may vary by study. If any research team member is unsure of what constitutes a new adverse event for a particular study as it relates to the protocol and the clinical condition of the subject, the PI must be engaged to clarify. The protocol may have adverse events of special interest that require specific reporting to the safety committee or may outline common adverse events expected to occur in the particular population under study. Adverse events are identified through a variety of methods, including subject interview, electronic health record review of recent medical encounters, laboratory results, ECGs, or other test results. Identification of adverse events should be done minimally at each encounter with the subject and more often depending on protocol risk requirements. Review of the electronic health record between subject encounters may be required. For studies with long periods between in-person visits, consider implementing regular check-ins, such as phone calls or telehealth visits, to monitor for potential AEs. Educate subjects at the time of consent and throughout the study on how and when to report any new symptoms, changes in health, or medical events between visits. Encourage them to reach out proactively. The next step of the adverse event management procedure is to assess and document the adverse event. The PI is responsible to ensure assessment documentation is in place for each adverse event. Assessment and documentation of the adverse event should be completed contemporaneously to the identification of an adverse event. Robust documentation of events and assessment should be tracked directly in the electronic health record. Every attempt should be made to record significant data and events in the medical record to ensure continuity of care between the research and clinical care teams, including contact information of the PI and study coordinator. It is advised that coordinators confirm with the PIs the best way to contact them if a quick response is needed. The research team should ensure that any original paper copies of source documentation are filed in the subject's study binder. The research team should ensure all data points are captured as required by the protocol. Depending on the event severity, typical examples of minimum assessment data includes the nature of the event, the severity of the event, the probable relationship of the adverse event to the research, the date and time of the adverse event onset, if available, the date and time of the adverse event resolution, if available, the start and stop dates of related concomitant medication administration or other interventions, the start and stop dates of test article administration, the clinical assessment of the research subject, the results of any laboratory tests and/or diagnostic procedures, and any needed follow-up and outcome. Using the adverse event log will provide an overview of all events the subject may be experiencing and assist in tracking events for assessment at each follow-up visit. Detailed information from the research notes is summarized into key data points in the adverse event log. The research team may use the adverse event log in the electronic health record, which is the preferred method, a sponsor-generated study-specific adverse event log, or the adverse event reporting log on paper to document and track adverse events. Regardless of which log is used, the requirement for adverse event documentation remains the same. Attention should be paid to tracking follow-up of the events, documenting changes in severity, frequency, or relatedness. Adverse events should be followed until resolution or protocol-defined end of reporting period. Follow-up data should be provided to the sponsor or reviewing IRB as required. Here is an image of the form MG-O-004.11 This form can be used by the study team to log and document adverse events for a subject throughout a study. This can be found at the end of the procedural document as Attachment B. Reporting of an adverse event is the final stage of adverse event management process. It is important to know and understand the reporting requirements and obligations based on the protocol, as well as all applicable IRB policies. The primary coordinator or data manager with oversight of the PI should regularly report any adverse event in accordance with the protocol and local policies, ensuring the use of appropriate method such as electronic databases and systems. The requirements of adverse event reporting should be reviewed by the sponsor at the site initiation visit. Training on protocol-specific adverse event reporting requirements must be repeated by the sponsor or study team for any new personnel added to the delegation log with responsibilities for adverse event reporting. Study personnel should know and be able to locate all pertinent local policy and provide to the sponsor as needed. Adverse events of special interest may not require prompt reporting to the sponsor. However, the adverse event may still meet expedited reporting requirements of the reviewing IRB. Now that we have covered all three steps in adverse event management, let's consider the following scenario. Participant 2 came to the hospital for visit 4 on June 8, 2025. The clinical research coordinator ensured all research required procedures were completed per the protocol. The principal investigator was not available early in the day, so the visit with the PI was scheduled for later in the day. The CRC asked the participant to wait for their appointment with the PI and left to work on another patient. The CRC was not present with the PI when they met with the participant. The CRC input this assessment note into the electronic health record after meeting with the participant. The PI input this assessment note into the electronic health record after meeting with the participant. In addition, the current plan was updated by the PI. The adverse event information was also updated by the PI. Can you identify what was improperly done in this scenario? Pause the video, review the adverse event assessment information provided, and write down your observations on a scratch piece of paper. There are two major concerns that you hopefully identified in the scenario. The CRC and the PI did not communicate effectively in this situation. The PI missed the adverse event where the burning sensation had occurred, and a concomitant medication was taken that should have required additional follow-up and assessment. The PI also did not follow up on past events. The insomnia did not appear resolved in the notes, so there should have been a comment that indicated the subject was asked about it. Okay, so let's assume for a moment that the CRC did in fact communicate the burning sensation side effect to the PI. There is a certain amount of data that should have been collected to allow for a complete assessment of the adverse event. What additional minimum assessment note data is missing from this scenario? Pause the video and write down the data that's missing on a scratch piece of paper. Let's take a moment to see if you were able to identify the minimum assessment data present, missing, and not relevant in the scenario. Let's start with the nature of the event. The CRC did mention the nature of the event in their note, that there was a burning sensation during the infusion. Again, assuming that the PI did know about the side effect, there is nothing in their notes about follow-up questions regarding the severity of the event or relationship of the AE to the research. Based on the CRC's notes, the date of onset is apparent as the burning sensation occurring during the visit. However, there is no notation about how long the AE lasted, which would indicate time. Also, the AE was resolved in the scenario after receiving additional medication, so the date of resolution is available. Again, because there is no information in the CRC's note about the duration of the AE, a time the AE resolved is not indicated. The subject received Benadryl, so a concomitant medication was used. However, there is no additional information that may be vital to the safety of the participant in engaging in the study, which should be assessed by the PI. Information about the test article related to the infusion is included in the CRC's notes. The PI did meet with the participant according to their notes, but there was no follow-up conversation for a clinical assessment regarding the burning sensation side effect. Because the AE was resolved with the Benadryl, no additional testing was required, so this data is not relevant in this situation. Finally, because the PI did not have a follow-up conversation with the participant to make a determination about next steps, there is no documentation about whether follow-up is necessary at the next visit. The outcome was documented by the CRC because the burning sensation ended, but the PI did not completely evaluate whether this is related to the research to anticipate whether this could be a problem in future visits. In addition, the CRC and PI should have referenced the protocol to ensure there was no additional steps that needed to be taken if a subject experienced burning sensations during an infusion. Now that we have discussed the adverse event management procedure, we are going to transition to additional considerations that should be made to the procedure. There are special procedures put in place with regards to encore and adverse event reporting. If the sponsor budget captures cost association with serious adverse events for commercial or federal clinical trials, this must be reported to encore. The minimum required fields of event date, reported date, and outcome must be included. The purpose of this reporting is to ensure the Administrative Financial Office is invoicing the sponsor to support the work. This is the first of two job aids that are available to you in the appendix. The first job aid, MG-O-004.11 JA1, focuses on demonstrating how to utilize the Adverse Event Log in MedConnect if you are an Investigator Intervention Research Coordinator. The job aid is approximately 9 pages long and covers a blank research adverse event log, documenting within the AE grid, accessing an existing AE log for additional documentation, accessing the textual rendition of the AE log using document viewing, accessing the textual rendition of an AE log using clinical documents, and forward the textual rendition of the AE log to a MedStar clinician. The image is just a small sample of the first page of the available job aid. The second job aid, MG-O-004.11 focuses on demonstrating how to utilize the adverse event log in MedConnect if you are an investigational intervention physician or APP. The job aid is approximately 6 pages long and covers modifying an adverse event log forwarded by a coordinator, accessing the textual rendition of an AE log using document viewing, accessing a blank AE log, and documenting within the AE grid. The image is just a small sample of the first page of the available job aid. In summary, consult the protocol and/or sponsor for clarification and guidance in any part of the adverse event management process. Assessment and documentation of the adverse event should be completed contemporaneously to the identification of an adverse event. Be sure to follow adverse events until resolution or the protocol-defined end of the reporting period. Throughout this video, guidance on the adverse event identification, assessment and documentation, and reporting was provided. Finally, additional on-core AE reporting requirements were discussed. This concludes the overview of procedure MG-O-004.11 on adverse event management. If you would like more information on Joint GU-MHRI procedures, please visit the website shared on the screen or visit MedStar Starport. Thanks and take care.